Whoever controls the finances, they kind of control the planet because they have no moral compass. Finances doesn't have a boundary. So as long as there's a monetary system in place, there's an incentive to disadvantage the planet. So the hidden hand within the transatlantic slave trade was the Jewish community's involvement in it, handling the merchant, the sailing, and the transport of Africans. Sit back and enjoy.
Every December, in the Netherlands and Belgium, a beloved mythical character comes to life. He's the companion of Sinterklaas, and his job is to deliver gifts to children. This is Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete. But what makes Zwarte Piet controversial is that he's portrayed by a person in blackface. Let's stop here for a minute. We'll come back to Zwarte Piet and why he's still a part of Dutch celebrations in a bit.
2,000 years ago, the German god Wodan drove around on a white horse with two black raven who eavesdropped on people through the chimney and tattled to their boss. That sounds familiar. And throughout history there have been traditions where people paint themselves black around New Year's to impersonate the devil or to scare the kids.
Ta-da!
And then we have Saint Nicholas, who visits Dutch and Belgian households around December 5th.
Hello.
At first he drops in alone. Well, him and his horse, of course. But in 1850 he gets a companion. That's when the storybook Saint Nicholas and His Servant appears. In these pictures we see our good saint accompanied for the first time by a somewhat dark-skinned employee. Not that strange, really, because in those days many distinguished people had coloured servants. And by hiring this minion, Saint Nick can focus on his core business as a friend to all children, while his subordinate manages the old-fashioned bag and rob. At first, the black assistant is an idiot who can't even speak properly. But slowly he evolves into a power Pete. The sometimes somewhat distracted good saint grows dependent on his skilled management assistant. And whether or not Pete is black from all that soot or not, it just wouldn't be the same without him.
Blackface is one of the most controversial costumes out there, and in recent years, there have been many who've come under fire for choosing to wear blackface.
I'd kill myself if I were black.
Oh, you can say whatever you want, you smelling.
People who wore blackface at some point in their careers were suddenly facing consequences.
It's not racist on Halloween. It's racist every day. There is no magical day where you can wear blackface with no repercussions.
I never should have done it. It is something absolutely unacceptable to do.
Blackface is racist because it turns black people into a costume and divorces them from their humanity. We're people, not costumes.
Let's get back to Zwarte Piet. He wears brightly colored Renaissance attire, curly afro wigs, exaggerated red lips, and gold jewelry. He comes to the Netherlands from Spain by steamboat as the helper of Sinterklaas. He is mischievous, playful, and helpful, checking whether children have been naughty or nice, giving sweets and gifts to the good children, and a bundle of birch branches to chastise naughty children. And in case we forgot to mention it before, Zwarte Piet has dark skin. Typically, a white actor will darken his skin for this role, making himself appear black. But for a region with such a small percentage of African population, why is this character black? The character's origins are not entirely clear, but some sources suggest that Zwarte Piet was initially meant to represent a Moor from Spain. The Moors were a Muslim population of North African and Iberian descent, who ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula, mainly modern-day Spain and Portugal, from the early 8th until the late 15th century. Zwarte Piet might have been influenced by 19th century European views and stereotypes of Moors and people of African descent. The Moors were not slaves, but conquerors and settlers who had significant influence on the culture, science, philosophy, and architecture of the region. However, during and after the Reconquista, the period of history where Christian kingdoms retook control of the Iberian Peninsula, many Moors were enslaved or expelled from Spain and Portugal. The more modern version of Zwarte Piet, popularized by Jan Schenkman in his book St. Nicholas and His Servant, shows Zwarte Piet as a dark-skinned helper dressed in page boy attire. Given the history of colonialism and slavery at that point in history, some interpretations associated Zwarte Piet with the caricature of enslaved Africans. Blackface has a long history of being used to mock, dehumanize, and perpetuate negative stereotypes about people of African descent. This practice originated in 19th century minstrel shows in the United States, where white performers would darken their skin and exaggerate their features to caricature black people, often depicting them as lazy, unintelligent, or criminal. The use of blackface contributed to the marginalization and mistreatment of black communities. There have been protests and campaigns to alter or eliminate the character from the holiday celebrations due to these concerns. In response to this criticism, some in the Netherlands and Belgium have started adapting the character by, for example, replacing the blackface makeup with soot smudges. This version is called Sooty Piet, and his black face is caused by going down chimneys to give children gifts, much like Santa Claus. But while many have called for the cancellation of Zwarte Piet, there are others who argue that he is a harmless and beloved children's character, and that the blackface portrayal is not meant to be a racial caricature. They claim it is an important part of their cultural heritage and see criticisms as an attack on their tradition.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands, a reasonably small country in today's Central Europe, whose only other possessions today are 3 Caribbean islands, Curaçao, Aruba, and Sint Maarten, with a population of around 17.4 million people. But the Dutch overseas possessions were much larger throughout history, and they once had a significant role as one of the main European colonizer powers. The map I used on the thumbnail and the one here is a little misleading because it is an anachronous map. This means that these are all the possessions the Dutch Empire had at any time overlapped, meaning they never held all of these at the same time. But still, for the purpose of this video and to make it more interesting, I'm going to follow the idea that all lands which were at any time under Dutch rule decided to reunite in current days. It would spread across almost all continents in the world, from New Amsterdam in North America to the Dutch Guianas, Dutch Brazil, and territories in today's Ghana, South Africa, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Taiwan, not to mention the many trade outposts they established throughout the African coast, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, and some apparently even in the coast of Chile in South America. On top of that, we also have to assume that their rule over the Benelux region would also have maintained itself, or would once again be a reality, and they would therefore also rule Belgium and Luxembourg in Europe. Now, it goes without saying that this scenario is absolutely and totally impossible. This is definitely just a what-if hypothetical scenario with no likelihood of ever happening. But I think it's interesting and fun to think about, especially because looking at the union of the territories with our current reality allows us to understand the size and dimension that certain empires, in this case the Dutch, really had at their peak. Before checking how the renewed empire would be like in modern days, let's quickly summarize how the Dutch Empire came to be and how it reached all of these places. The Dutch Empire divided itself into 2 areas, the East Indies in Oceania and Asia, and the West Indies in America. Africa, I think, was divided along the 2. It also divided itself into 2 methods throughout both of these areas: the establishment of true colonies with large territorial rule, and the mere establishment of trade factories or fortresses to use the trade routes and have a presence in those regions. So let's take a quick look region by region to understand which areas they ruled and which areas would now become a part of the empire again should the impossible ever happen. In Africa, most of their presence was through these trade factories, essentially military and economical outposts that existed throughout the African coast. However, they did have some territorial exploration and colonies per se. In South Africa, they briefly ruled the Cape of Good Hope and surrounding areas before losing them to the British. In West Africa, they held the Dutch Gold Coast in Ghana, a part of Angola, Senegal, and the island of Arguin off the coast of Mauritania. In East Africa, they controlled the island of Mauritius near Madagascar. In Asia, their presence was gigantic, and although it was also mainly through trading posts, they also held significant land. The most obvious cases are Indonesia, of course, Ceylon, and Taiwan, but they also had actual colonies in India. Coromandel and its coast was the major Dutch colony on the mainland. It grew from the fort at Pulicat, captured from the Portuguese in 1609. In fact, many of the Dutch colonies throughout America, Africa, or Asia were captured and taken from the Portuguese. In most, if not all cases, during the time when Spain briefly ruled Portugal, the Dutch were at war with the Spanish, and since the Spanish cared more about their own empire than the Portuguese one, they left Portuguese colonies mostly undefended, and the Dutch took the opportunity to seize them. The rest of their Asian empire consisted mostly of those trading outposts in Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Yemen, Bangladesh, Oman, Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, and also Madagascar. So I don't know how any of these would now join a modern Dutch empire, since their presence in those regions was mostly a group of buildings. Maybe the city in which they were in could join, and the empire would have a network of small city-states throughout the world. In America, they also had significant possessions. New Netherlands consisted of parts of today's US regions of Albany and the state of New York, and the city of New York itself in Manhattan, at the time, New Amsterdam. They also ruled the Dutch Antilles in the Caribbean, and this would today give them ownership of many islands, although they still currently have some of them. St. Martin, the Virgin Islands, Aruba, Curaçao, and Tobago would be among these. In South America, they held Suriname, part of Guyana, and New Holland, which was Dutch Brazil. Again, a group of territories captured during the Iberian Union. It's interesting because this capture was a part of a plan the Dutch had called the Grand Design, in which they aimed to capture strategic locations from the Portuguese and Spanish in order to control the main trade goods and routes, such as sugar, for instance, thus eliminating Spanish profits and making it so that they would have no money to continue the war against them. It's a smart strategy. Even if your enemy has a much stronger army and navy than you, you don't need to defeat it in combat. You just need to make sure the army collapses through any other means, such as lack of money to sustain it. There were also brief expeditions and trading posts in Chile. Back in Europe, they would hold Belgium and Luxembourg, and in Oceania, they also apparently had a claim on Western Australia and Tasmania. Although no real attempt of colonization was ever made, a lot of places along the Australian coast have Dutch names, and Tasmania used to be called Van Diemen's Land. So if this impossible scenario were to happen, it's hard to tell how all of these regions would now become part of the same empire. The entire countries which they ruled, sure, those could become a part of it. Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Indonesia, Luxembourg, Belgium, and all the islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere. But what about the partial possessions they had? Would the state of New York and Albany suddenly join them, or only part of the state? And would the other partial possessions in Brazil, South Africa, India, Angola, Ghana, and Senegal split from their own countries to join the Dutch? The scenario itself is already totally impossible, but the logistics of it make it even more absolutely crazy and unachievable, not to mention the tons of trading outposts they had. I think these would just have to be ignored, because otherwise there would just be small neighborhoods in each country that randomly belonged to the Dutch, like that weird Belgian exclave that actually exists inside the Netherlands. So in terms of size, it's very difficult to calculate exactly, but this new empire would certainly become one of the top 10 countries in the world in terms of size, even with just the full countries they used to rule. Indonesia alone is already in 14th place, so it wouldn't be difficult. It would also become the only country/union in the world with possessions and a presence in 4 or even 5 continents. But because of this, its culture would also be incredibly different throughout the regions. Each place has their local identity, even if there might be some small or large influence due to Dutch presence at some point in their history. They also have very different religions. Indonesia is mostly Muslim, while the Netherlands are Protestant, and some other territories are Roman Catholic. Now, a lot of countries have diverse religions within them, even some off this list, and in secular states, it really doesn't matter which religion each person chooses to follow, because it doesn't, as it shouldn't, affect state policy.
Okay, so that was a sanitized version of how the Dutch East and Dutch West companies operated. But I think you guys need to know just how deep this rabbit hole goes regarding the Jewish involvement in the slave trade and why New York City, New York is the epicenter of all of this. And who built Wall Street? What exactly Wall Street was built off of? So the Dutch created the what was called the poppy boom. There was not poppy. The Dutch created what was called the tulip craze. And tulips were the first thing that became this huge, I would say, spark and boom, market boom. And it had a value that went up and a value that went down. So the idea of a marketplace, as far as the I would say the precursor to the Wall Street, would have been the whole tulip craze. And that was created in the Netherlands by Dutch financial companies and so many Dutch Ashkenazi Jews. And some that were Sephardim got very wealthy off this, but mainly Ashkenazi. And so I think it's important to know that that's how the Dutch community moved into the merchant aspects of trading and why trade ended up going global. As I said, partially due to a lack of sugarcane. The Dutch East and Dutch West Indian Company were the world's first multinational companies. And multinational was because they had set up ports in multiple different countries, because they went into their land and said, we're taking it. So that would be, they set up ports, in all the map that you would have just seen in general. But like in China, they got China heavily addicted to opium from them going in and trying to take advantage of China with Silk Road exchange. That was actually the first drug dealing. The very first multinational drug deal came from the Dutch East Indian Company, but the Dutch West Indian Company focused on the transport of Africans, slave trading, pretty much behind sugarcane, fur, and cotton, and other resources as well, but those are the most prominent ones. So sit back and enjoy yourselves. Hey guys, if you want to watch more clips, click here.
And if you want to watch the full podcast, click right here.